Hi, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Charles Rogel. I'm the Vice President of Consulting Services here at DecisionWise, and I will be our host. Our webinar topic today is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Developing a Clear Roadmap. And I'm fortunate to be joined by Kristin Chapman, who is the Managing Director of People and Culture at AAA National. Kristin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Charles. I'm really excited to be here today. You know, a little bit of my journey since reading National Geographic as a child, I've always been fascinated by different cultures. And so I actually studied cultural anthropology from Brigham Young University and then did a master's in business administration from Washburn. And through my education and also traveled to quite a number of different countries, you know, I've really understood and learned how great leaders push power down and how important the leaders at the top are in influencing culture. So I've worked in management consulting. I've worked with organizations around leadership engagement, leadership development. And currently I'm part of AAA. I joined as the Director of Talent Development, Diversity and Inclusion. And now, as you mentioned, in a managing director role of people and culture. So really excited to be here and be able to have this conversation.
Excellent. Thanks, Kristin. Let's jump into our agenda for today. So we've got this set up a bit to kind of talk about, you know, the terms around DEI, the concepts, kind of what's going on in the world around DEI. We'll share some of the DecisionWise research. So what I hope to contribute is what we're measuring. You know, DecisionWise does employee surveys. We've been doing a lot of measuring lately around this topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I've got some data to share. And then we'll jump into kind of some myths, talk about how, you know, this multicultural continuum, kind of where's your organization? And then really, I think the most interesting part of this story will be the efforts and initiatives that Kristin and her team have worked on at AAA and just what they've learned so far. So a lot of good content to share with you today, and we do want to encourage you to participate. Again, we don't consider ourselves the experts. We're just sharing kind of what we've discovered so far, and we hope to augment that with your contribution as well. So Kristin, here's kind of some terminology, and this was interesting as we were kind of preparing, and I was doing a bunch of Google searches on these different words. I came up with a variety of different definitions that people are using around these terms: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I was curious to kind of get your take on how we've, you know, worded these.
Good question. And you know what's interesting in our journey, we've been talking about these definitions that you hear a lot about for many years. And we just sat down recently with our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Council, and we have been going through the exercise of sort of evolving or redefining them a little bit. And Charles, it's not an easy task. And I think the thing here, you know, there's some commonalities in the definitions, and especially around equity. You know, I think that's pretty consistent definition you have here. You know, but what does inclusion look like in your organization? What does diversity look like in your organization? And you know, I think that really varies, and that's part of the, you know, looking at what does it need to be? Where do you need that diversity to be, and how do you want that inclusion to show up? So I think for us, we found that it's evolved over time.
Yeah, and we've got a slide for each of these to kind of broaden this discussion a bit more. So that's a good setup for kind of what we're trying to address. Before we jump in, you know, what we've seen, especially in the United States, so now we're going to take a very US-centric approach to this, is all of the different, you know, topics and influences, discussions, you know, protests, you know, everything that's happened in America so far. And so, you know, all of these have been influenced by the pandemic, by policy making. You know, I've got a picture of Washington, D.C. here, immigration policy. You know, we're thinking about how to involve veterans in our organizations, no, I can't even speak. Help me out.
LGBTQ, yes.
Thank you. When I have to say the word, I can't say it. Black Lives Matter, you know, and even, you know, disabled or different abilities. So we're trying to kind of really get our heads around what does it mean in our organization. It's been interesting, you know, at DecisionWise, we've been measuring this. I have found that, of course, organizations that are located either multinational organizations or those located more in larger metro areas, again, are going to be more concerned and want to be measuring about these topics. I have other clients that work, in the middle of America in a small town where there isn't a lot of diversity and these topics aren't as, I don't know, salient to them right now or urgent, for example. And so there hasn't been as much interest. So it has varied a bit, but I think the discussion is out there and ongoing and really influencing kind of how we're trying to approach this now. Anything you want to add about some of these topics, Kristin?
Just that, as our journey has evolved, some of these things that you mentioned here, they definitely have been heightened, and they do cause you to kind of recalibrate and look at where are we and where do we want to go. So yeah, I think one of the themes you're going to hear today is that this is really a journey, but I will also reinforce that it's a journey that everyone needs to be on. It's not really an option anymore, and so I guess that's what I would start with.
Yeah, I think in a way we've been somewhat resistant, or maybe I think people have just sat on the sidelines and say, well, do we really need to? Is there an issue? I think everything's okay. No, there's an issue and we need to be attentive to it. So most organizations are jumping right in with both feet, which is great to see. Okay, so we talked about, we're going to have kind of a slide for diversity, equity, and inclusion here. And to your point, Kristin, when we talk about diversity, a lot of times we think about the topics kind of in the first column here, these kind of what we're labeling personal characteristics isn't even a great group name here, but race, age, nationality, ethnicity, things like that. But it's broader than that, right? There's other areas and things to consider. And so I'm curious, Kristin, as you've been kind of, navigating this, what has kind of expanded or what's kind of played out in terms of your views on these different areas?
Yes, and I think that if any of you have been on this journey for some time, you're familiar with the diversity dimensions wheel, right? And it kind of captures these how do you primarily identify yourself? And what I've learned is someone who maybe is a person of color, they may primarily define themselves as a person of color, but they may not. They may primarily define themselves as someone who has a PhD, for example. So really what we see and what people's actual lived experiences that define them can vary. And so really that's kind of a first step is understanding what diversity looks like in your organization and what do you want that to look like.
Yeah, and I did recently a survey with a multinational organization to actually capture this information. So have people self-report on nationality, ethnicity, race, and religious background. Just, basically it was a volunteer kind of survey. And it was really interesting to see the results because some people said in terms of like nationality, they claimed too. They said, well, I was raised in Belgium, but I consider myself Canadian or something like that. So they had kind of a lot of different backgrounds kind of mixed together that didn't really fit the stereotypes, right, that we typically think of people from different nationalities and cultures. There's a lot of, as we get more global, there's a lot of mix and differences that we're seeing that aren't captured neatly in these categories.
I think that's a really good point. On our initial journey, we decided to focus on gender and ethnicity or race as our primary, area of focus. We've evolved that. We continue to look at that, but we are trying to be more broad and almost to discuss how do we bring in people who are different than us, not similar to me mentality, or that have diverse lived experiences. Again, I don't want to underestimate the traditional demographics and from our Title VII Civil Rights Act, those different groups that have been historically marginalized. That's really important to look at. But again, it kind of evolves a little bit based on what you're trying to do and what your communities look like, what your employees look like, what your customer segment looks like. So it's a little more complex than just saying, this is what we mean by diversity.
Yeah. And so equity, we wanted to kind of break out what we're talking about in terms of equality and equity. In the past, we've talked about equality. And as you can see here from the definition, that just means everyone's kind of given the same resources or opportunities. But equity is different in that it, like it says here, recognizes that each person has different circumstances, and then it allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So we're talking more about the outcome that you want to achieve as opposed to maybe the starting line that you're trying to equalize in a way.
And I think, again, that's been something that has been a learning, kind of a national learning experience, that really the most effective change, you have to look through that equity lens, right? And in order to do that, you've got to have an understanding, of the structural systems or the societal systems in which we're currently working, and understanding what's not equitable and where those inequities, exist, and how do we break down those inequities. And they exist within companies, they exist within even a smaller team within a department.
Good point. And then finally, inclusion. Here we kind of break this out, so we talk about the sense of belonging, but there's kind of these three areas here. So is there a sense of balance for less represented groups? Are there any barriers to entry? And then are there any blind spots? So assumptions that we might have that work against creating an inclusive environment. We'll touch on these again in the presentation, but yeah, this one's a harder one to kind of put your finger on in a way, because I think different people have a different perception of what it means to be included.
And one of the best measures that I've found, and I like this balance, barriers, blind spots. I think it's a good representation of what we're trying to do. But one of the best measures is asking that question. I feel like I belong here on an engagement survey. And then looking at the responses based on, again, what those different demographic or diversity groups that are important in your organization, what are each of those groups saying? And, that is a really great starting point to understand that belonging, that inclusion.
So here is some data. So looking at our DecisionWise global database, this includes millions of responses from organizations all over the world. Although I'd say about 75% of the responses we see here are from US-based companies. These are kind of two specific questions that we're asking around diversity, equity, inclusion. So you can see the first one, employees are treated here equally regardless of race, ethnicity, and so on. And then the breakouts, we have the global score. So 78% in our global database, this blue bar at the top, they said agree or strongly agree to this statement. So that's the entire population. When we look at whites, 83% agree with that statement. If Asian population, 73%, Hispanic, Latino, 80% agreement. And then what stands out here is the Black or African American response to this question. This is based over the past 3 years of our data, is only at 72% agreement. So it's still pretty good. 3/4 of the population is still agreeing. We've got some people that are neutral or disagreeing to these statements on a 5-point scale. But you can see there are differences, globally across our database. And this plays out differently within each organization where we measure these items. But again, some discrepancies here. And then when we ask this question about, does this organization attract, develop, or retain people with diverse backgrounds, even more variability with the Black or African American population. And then somewhat surprisingly, Hispanic Latino group or population scores higher, 80% favorable on that particular question. So again, different perceptions play out on these questions depending upon your background and experience.
We saw this consistent as well in our organization over this last year. If we consider the tragedy that our, Black African American colleagues and, friends and neighbors have dealt with, it's been a tough journey, and for many years, but it kind of came to a head. So yes, we there are concerns there that we've seen as well, and it's an important time to address those concerns. What's interesting about the Hispanic or Latino response is we do see in the data that we have an increasing, growth of our Latina population in the U.S. and more Latinos are going to college and getting degrees and joining the workforce. So, that's a group that is growing here, and so it may be reflected in that number.
So let's talk about a few kind of diversity facts and myths here. So I'll just kind of list these here and then have you kind of address them here, Kristin. So first of all, diversity is about race and gender. We touched on this a bit.
Yeah, I think when anyone starts in this journey, that is kind of the primary place of starting, right? It's something we can see visually. We see our differences in how we look or whether we're male or female. But again, that's making a lot of assumptions about how each individual person identifies. And really, as we've discussed, it's so much broader than that.
Next one here is equity and equality mean the same thing. I think we covered that one pretty clearly on the previous slide. Anything you want to add there?
There's a great picture of two people looking over, and it looks like they're the same. But then when you look behind the fence, one of them has a box that person's using to stand in order to have that same access to see over the fence. So I think that's, again, a good sort of visual representation of what we're talking about here.
Perfect. Inclusion is about bringing people in the group. That seems pretty reasonable.
It does seem reasonable. And I think, we do all this work on defining diversity and trying to hire, and then we bring people into our organization, and it's challenging, right? It's challenging for those who aren't part of what is considered the norm or the status quo. So really, inclusion is not about bringing people into the group. It's about expanding the group, right? So if you picture a circle that represents your group or your team or your company, adding another person to that group, it's not about squeezing them in the circle that exists or assimilating. It's about expanding that circle and giving space and making that circle larger. Not forcing people into our way of doing things, but learning from each other and broadening our collective perspective and ideas.
Yeah, I think we have this approach that we want to integrate people into the way we do things around here, as opposed to expand how we think about things to include their perspectives equally. And then, of course, diversity and inclusion is HR's responsibility. They're the ones kind of pushing all this stuff, right? So
well,
making us do it.
Diversity and inclusion is the responsibility of the C-suite. The CEO is ultimately the chief diversity officer, the chief culture officer. So, the day-to-day activities are definitely the responsibility or can be helped by HR as well as the leaders. But it really is a shared responsibility, a shared focus. So typically, I think the statistics I've seen at about 59% of our organizations, HR will oversee the diversity efforts. But really, it is the role of that C-suite that sets the strategy, guides the direction, and then it's leaders who have to actually have the conversations, make the changes to the way business is done. And that's really, that's the recipe for all of those stakeholders working together for success.
Hiring a white male doesn't help increase diversity. Who would disagree with that?
Well, again, I think I like this because it is a myth in many ways. Now, white males aren't considered diverse in the US, or they're not a historically excluded group, right? But again, I go back to what group are you working in? So if you're hiring a white male into an all-female team, then you're creating more diversity for that team. And then, a white male, what if it's a LGBTQ? You don't see that, right? Yeah. By someone, the first impression. As someone that's handicapped or an older worker, again, diversity has multifacets. And so to make a blanket statement, again, it depends on what group you're looking at and who you're talking about.
Someone who is diverse is more inclusive.
This has been a learning. I think we make assumptions that those who have been marginalized are going to be more understanding, more inclusive. And oftentimes that's the case. I mean, the empathy and the emotional intelligence, often you can have that from those who have been in those experiences and had to kind of navigate being a minority in a majority group. But I've had experiences where, I've hired people in one point in my career, two people with the same diverse background, and they were more exclusive than the majority in their actions and behaviors. So again, I think it's just one of those assumptions we make. I had a former colleague mention that, the way he grew up, and he was an ethnically diverse individual compared to the US standards, but, he was taught, my mom taught me to hang out with people, be with people who are like me. So that even is a good explanation for how that happens sometimes, right?
Yeah, we tend to want to integrate, and so we kind of lose or don't emphasize our diversity if we are diverse, so to speak. And then, we'll talk. Maybe we can talk about what microaggression is as well. But victims of microaggressions are never aggressors.
Again, it kind of relates to the myth prior to that we just discussed. Microaggression is really a statement, action, or an incident that is an instance of indirect, subtle, or even intentional discrimination against a marginalized group, right? Such as a ethnic minority, race, gender, whatever.
Yeah.
But again, sometimes those who have been the recipient of microaggressions might turn around and make statements themselves or be aggressors themselves. So while you would hope that's not the case, I guess in my experience, I've learned that these are some of the assumptions that we can't. It's not that simple, right? There's not a one size fits all. There's not. None of this is one or two dimensional. Diversity is as complex and varied and wonderful as the human experience is, really.
Right. No, good point. And I do want to recognize the questions that we've received so far. I see a couple of them here that I want to save to the end because I think we'll kind of touch on them as we go, and we want to make sure we wrap them up nicely. So please keep the questions coming, and again, we will address them as well as at the end here. Okay, so now organizations, they're kind of light bulbs going off. They're saying we really got to get on the ball here in terms of our DEI initiatives and get things going and make this a priority. And so then we kind of jump into this, and our typical approach includes kind of these bullet points here. So Kristin, I'm curious if you can kind of give us the typical response maybe, and maybe some of the pros and cons as we talk to these.
Yeah, and again, I would say typical isn't necessarily bad, but maybe it's not enough, right? So I would say that the approach to D&I again is kind of a journey of testing something out, learning and adjusting, and even if you have the perfect plan or the perfect roadmap that you think that you've laid out, you will not have it 100% right. You will need to adjust and adapt, and you will learn things along the way. And that's really something to embrace. In fact, I was talking to someone a couple of weeks ago, and that was the concern. Look, our CEO is worried that we're going to do this wrong. And I said, you're absolutely going to do this wrong at times. I mean, it's just how it is. But, if you're thoughtful, if you bring in, good perspectives, if you learn from other people, you'll and then you adjust, right? And you'll be more successful. So a lot of times organizations start with, let's create a business case, right? And that's either a legal case, right? It's
minimize risk.
Yeah, there's these EEOC laws, there's the Title VII, there's the Equal Pay Act, there's the age discrimination, right? The ADA of 1990, even the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So these kind of become, okay, there's a legal case why we need to do this. Often then it kind of evolves to be more of a business case, right? So we study and find great research that, diverse companies are 33% more likely to have greater financial returns than their less diverse industry peers. I mean, that's a pretty common one.
There's advantages too.
Yeah.
Not just mitigating risk. Yeah.
Exactly. So higher innovation, right? In companies that are diverse, diverse boards, especially with females. There's a study out there that talks about the return. The ROI, the financial returns are higher. We know from recent data now that 67% of job seekers, particularly millennials, and now the Gen Z are looking for brands that actively promote diversity inclusion, and millennials make up 75% of the job market within the next couple of years. So
it's funny too, as we're doing employee surveys, I'm seeing in comments more and more people do notice the diversity of the executive team, and they will comment and say more diversity on the executive team. They're tuned into it, so it is front of mind.
Well, and we have 5 generations in the workplace. It spans, right? And think of how much, even just in the last year and a half, how much things have changed with COVID and how we've pivoted on so many fronts, even in our own work experience, right? Moving to a virtual work from home and the technology. So, I think that these business cases, and sometimes it's a moral case, right? People say, well, it's the right thing to do. So that's where, but the point is, there's typically a business case. We jump into training programs and say we're going to train people on diversity and unconscious bias. We form a couple of employee resource groups, which are, again, kind of ally groups, sometimes called business resource groups, but really groups that have similar kind of beliefs or demographics, right? Like an Asian American group or a Black group, a Hispanic, women's network, right? Yeah, veterans. So, and those are all wonderful because they provide a place for people to engage and have conversations, and you hopefully educate your organization and you bring, other allies into. Surveying is pretty typical, where you're asking questions. You're maybe a diversity and inclusion index on your engagement survey, which is what we have done. We do charitable giving, maybe hire a DE&I expert at some point, and we look at some of our basic harassment and discrimination policies and do trainings there. So those are kind of the typical initial approaches to D&I.
Excellent. And so now we'll kind of set this, and we'll kind of revisit some of these as we talk about how to kind of put them together. And before we get there, part of what we want to set up here is to kind of say, well, where is your organization on a continuum of being a monocultural type organization to a multicultural organization? And so how are we doing? Like, where would we kind of put ourselves? And so we've got several kind of boxes here, areas that we talk about. First is this exclusionary one. So again, we want to maintain the status quo, the majority dominance. And pause me here, Kristin, if you want to jump in as well and talk to some of these. Then there's more of a club mentality. So it's a little bit more loosely. We're not so deliberate about creating an exclusive environment, but we're still trying to maintain their traditional social power. Then we get more to this compliance piece I think you just addressed. Like, we have to kind of be in line with the laws and regulations that are there. So, we're allowing permission. And we're trying to more actively. Affirming means we're kind of moving a little bit more. So now we're promoting and supporting. We're trying to make an active effort to improve our inclusion efforts.
Yeah, programs, right? They're targeted to. It's going back to that equity that we talked about, right? So how do we ensure the success of people being able to move up? I mean, the programs are often targeted at this problem everybody has or has had, which is even with your efforts on compliance or actively recruiting, it takes time to build that internal mobility, right? And build that talent pipeline within your organization. So we typically see we do well in those frontline roles or maybe the next couple of levels up. But as we move up in the organization, we tend to have less diversity. So these kinds of programs and looking again at the diverse groups in your organization, try to increase that mobility, that professional pathway.
Yeah, and it seems like compliance then being a more reactive approach, affirming now is a more proactive approach as we go up the scale. And here I'll insert one of the questions that we received from the audience in that, well, how do we kind of prevent reverse discrimination, right? So we want to be more affirming, we want to be more proactive, hire a more diverse workforce, but what is that, at what cost, right? So does that hurt us in some way? Or, the reverse discrimination question, kind of always comes up.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the affirmative action, days, and where this was also a conversation. But in my experience, the reality is, if you are making a conscious effort to actively recruit qualified people. You don't give up. You just have to put out that, that, I guess, open that door. And you find that there is a wonderful mix of diverse, again, how do you define diversity? Of diverse people.
Candidates,
But you have to make that conscious effort. You can't just say, well, we really only, want to focus on skill, experience, and talent based on the job description. You're gonna tend to hire people similar than you. There's so much data that shows that. Unless you have a conscious effort to broaden it, right? And to say, if I have two equally qualified candidates and one happens to be this, of this diversity versus another, or maybe a non-diverse candidate, then you make that decision to hire that diverse candidate if those skills are equal. So again, it has to be intentional.
Yeah, and I guess we're saying you're not settling. You're trying to, you're trying to expand your recruiting efforts. You have a broader pool, hopefully, to choose from to make some good selections. Redefining then is kind of saying, now we're trying to value and capitalize on diversity, make this a competitive advantage. We're not just, playing around with programs, so to speak, and here we're really making this more intentional.
This is where we're seeing, some pretty cool things, and there's all kinds of case studies out there, either leveraging employee resource groups or councils where, it has turned from diversity is a nice to have and important to, wow, our different perspectives are creating better products and service, better experiences for our customers. And so there is that pivot point where it becomes almost this momentous force within an organization. And it becomes just so much a part of the fabric of who the organization is.
Yeah, you're starting to realize benefits now.
Absolute benefits.
So it's paying off.
Yep.
And then all the way on the other opposite end of the scale, so being a true kind of multicultural organization. So here, it's kind of built into your DNA more. So your organization does reflect this diversity, and you're more of an example. You're kind of engaged in broader external social responsibilities. You're kind of being more of an ambassador of diversity as opposed to just a promoter.
What's interesting is I have in the past worked with different organizations. It's always interesting to ask, where do you think you are? And then where do you want to be? And what I've found is that the most sort of in tune organizations are pretty honest about, well, we're maybe in compliance or we're kind of trying to move into this affirming.
Yeah.
But they will also say, look, multicultural sounds like a place we'd love to get to at some point, but our goal right now is just to get really good at affirming and then be able to move into that redefining space. We've got to do some internal work, and I think this is what we saw in some instances that didn't happen last year, right at this time. A lot of companies went out and said more externally that this is what we believe, this is our commitment. Yeah. But then some of the holes get poked internally because that work hasn't been done fully inside.
Yeah, employees like, really? What about this and this?
At the same time, on the other side, silence can mean complicitness, right? Or not inaction. So there's this delicate balance you have to find, but I'll talk a little bit more about the AAA approach, but it's been important to us to make sure that we have our house sort of cleaned before we start making broad statements around social justice and other issues. Again, a place to get to, but you can't force that journey there are techniques, but you can't force it sooner than you can actually build the capability to get there.
Right. Yeah. It comes across insincere. Like, we saw it during Pride Month. A lot of companies kind of changed their logo to put the Pride flag on it. And they typically didn't have a stellar reputation when it came to supporting, supporting the groups that they're now promoting in a way. And so it comes across as insincere, maybe as the word I'm looking for, just, jumping on the bandwagon, so to speak, as opposed to being sincere about it. Well, here I've kind of set up, or we've kind of proposed a framework here to say, your approach to diversity, equity, inclusion kind of spans, different levels, individual, team, leaders in the organization. And there's kind of a continuum where if you're focusing on the individual, you're looking at things like, diversity, equity, inclusion training. And then if you're looking at the organization responsibility, we're looking at kind of the structure, policies, products and marketing. So Kristin, do you want to kind of describe this a little bit more as it pertains to AAA?
Absolutely. And, I think the way I would best describe here at AAA National, and again, AAA National is the association that really helps to partner with our clubs. So we're a large organization, but the group I'm talking about here right now is our national office of about 500 people. And so really at National, we have been on a journey to kind of have a parallel path of transforming our mindsets, our work practices, through this kind of DEI training, giving individual learning to our employees, giving people the opportunity to do their best work. But our journey includes this other path, both the individual as well as the organization structure. And I think that's what we have learned, that it's not just when we think of organizational development, if anyone's familiar with organizational development, you talk about who's the target of your focus. Well, a lot of times organizations start with the target being the individual. And, again, we mentioned employee resource groups and training, and, all of those are really important. How do we change the hearts and minds of the people? How do we broaden their perspectives?
Yeah.
But then really what we have found to be the most impactful and are finding to be most impactful is this parallel path with focusing on the organization. And really it's the goal there is to integrate diversity inclusion into all aspects, right? From people practices to business practices. And so in our journey, how we have supported that is we created a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, which focuses specifically on diverse, inclusive, and equitable practices within our national office. And so they really fill three roles. Our council, they are an advisory body to our officer team, there to suggest things based on what they see, based on their experience, their representation across the organization. They're an implementation body, so they actually lead initiatives that are business tied specifically to business outcomes. And then they're also ambassadors, right? So they're kind of the eyes and ears of the organization. So again, I would say there's this parallel path that is an important part of your roadmap in order to make the biggest change.
Yeah, and one question came in just about AAA. I mean, AAA is the
American Automobile Association. I apologize. Yeah.
So been around for over 100 years, focus a lot on insurance as well as other services, right?
Well, we actually, again, diverse portfolio. Our journey started about almost 120 years ago now, back in 1902. And really, what's really cool, I think, about AAA is that we have a pretty powerful mission that's very well aligned with diversity and inclusion. And that's really to provide safety, security, and peace of mind to our members, to our employees, and to our community. And so, again, integrating diversity, equity, inclusion into everything that we do is par for the course for us. And it's right. When we started our journey, it's not about just talking the talk. Again, that can happen, and you do have to speak up, but it's also making sure that we're doing what we say, and we're really looking for things that are going to make that long-term positive change. But to answer your question, Charles, American Automobile Association, we represent about 60 million members across the U.S. and Canada. We represent 25 different clubs with varying geographic and demographic footprints. representing diverse communities, then collectively we represent tens of thousands of employees across our different clubs. So it's a very diverse organization. And then our portfolio includes everything from our emergency roadside service to travel to financial services, like you mentioned. So sorry, I should have probably introduced that. AAA is kind of a household name, but not everybody, I guess, knows that.
Sure. Perfect. Now, I've kind of set up here, you talk great. So you got the committee that you talked about that kind of helps inform, the policies and whatnot, and also the executive team. And then we're kind of reintroducing these kind of structural blind spots and barriers that we talked about earlier. Is that part of the committee's responsibility to help kind of, shine a light on those to the organization?
Yeah, and I think that this is what is a really important concept. And you mentioned it earlier, blind spots and barriers. A blind spot is not something that you intend, right? Mm-hmm. It's not something, it's kind of like when you're driving a vehicle. You have that, you look behind you or to the side and you might have a blind spot. So what do? We put up a mirror to help to manage that. And so the idea of structural blind spots, they're often not created intentionally. Sometimes they are created intentionally, but most of the time it's not conscious. It's unconscious. It's because our policies and practices were created by a majority, not a minority. So looking and trying to understand, and again, as you bring diverse people in the organization, they help to point those out. But even if you can create those conversations internally with people who are the majority, they begin to kind of catch the excitement of looking at this and understanding. So one simple example, a supplier diversity, that's one simple way from a business perspective that you can change the kinds of partners, the kinds of vendors that you work with, is just by putting some language in your RFP process in your procurement. So those are some examples of what we mean by structural blind spots.
Then as kind of we kind of cascade back down, we look at kind of the leader's responsibility. Here we're kind of labeling this as buy-in and action is kind of the focus.
I will say this probably, I think it's one of the most important things, and that is, I've seen situations where you have maybe a group within an organization that really works hard to create this diversity, this inclusion, this belonging. If it's not more broadly supported from the top down, it's really hard for it to stick and really grow within your organization. So I'm a huge believer that you've got to have that buy-in and support from the top and at all levels of the organization. But starting at the top is really, it's the most important step. And, one of the things that I think has helped us on our journey is we've had multiple board chairs dating back to the late 90s who have backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds. I mean, our Black chairman of the board, Charles Allen in the late 90s for us. And then we've had a succession of Black, Hispanic, female, women of color, and female or women of color. And so, I think it's an important tone to set. And then again, your CEO and your executive team become critical in this as well.
And then finally, we say at the individual level, we're trying to measure impact, right? So those are the perceptions that we're trying to change or improve or monitor in a way. And so, what else would you say about that piece?
Well, there's many ways to measure impact, and you really just have to get clear on what those metrics are. And I would say ultimately for us, one of our key indicators that we are ready to have a more broad voice, kind of as we think about that multicultural spectrum that we just spoke about. If someone off the street who's one of your employees were asked, well, do you support as an organization diversity, equity, inclusion? They've got to be able to say yes. If your employees don't know how to speak about that or what you're doing around diversity and inclusion, then you're not quite there yet. And again, it takes all of the team, the leaders, and the individual to support those efforts.
And then another question here in terms of how you impact the leader component of this, coaching, training, both, what's an experience with both? What's your take on that?
I'm a huge proponent of coaching because I think it's much more personalized, but it's also, it's more costly. It's not always feasible for organizations. So, if you can build that capability again, within your leaders, then you can more easily coach, employees within your organization. So, and again, I'll just mention there's some really interesting data that came out in 2020. I believe it's through McKinsey. And it just talked about, I think, $80 billion over the last, 15 to 20 years on diversity training. And yet we arrived at the place that kind of came to a head a little over a year ago with George Floyd and kind of brought that national attention and focus, and which was a wonderful way, it was a horrible event, but it was a wonderful outcome and outpouring of organizations saying this just has to stop. So, I think that again, it's that training is important, but it's changing the essence of the organization. It's embedding those right kinds of policies and practices into the fabric of who you are. So as new people come in to the organization, they come into a culture that it's a part of who the organization is versus, okay, now we're going to put everybody through training and that's how we're going to get people to believe and buy in and support our efforts.
Right. So let's talk about some of your learnings then. So as you've gone through this, we've kind of listed a few of these and we've touched on kind of this question of what diversity do you need? Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, I would say you have to ask the question, what are you solving for?
Yeah.
And, are you looking at your whole organization? Are you looking at a business unit or a team? And I think then diversity needs to be defined based on what you're really looking at. So do you need more women in technology? Do you need more veterans? But in one of the ways to help you decide that, obviously you want to look at your communities, right? Where you are. You want to represent your communities that your company is in. You want to look at your customer base. What products and services do they need? What are we missing out on? And then how do we hire people who can represent the customers that we aspire to serve? That's one of the ways to kind of build that case for your leaders and your organization. It is, and it's very real. It ties to ROI, but you've got to understand what it is that you're trying to solve for.
Goals and incentives. What did you try there?
My CEO is quoted, I think anybody in the organization could quote him for saying, what can't be measured won't be managed. So I came into AAA seeing some incentive goals around diverse candidates on every interview panel. And at that point, we were defining diversity as gender and ethnic diversity. And at first, I was a little taken aback because I thought, wow, that's specific. And are there unintended consequences by doing that? So it's kind of that question around reverse discrimination that we talked about earlier. But as I've seen it play out, we have not sacrificed quality, right? We have not sacrificed people who have excellent credentials. We've created more of an awareness, more of a fine tuning, and been able to bring in, exceptional talent that is diverse. So in talking to a number of advisors who have been doing this for many, many years and been in this conversation around diversity and inclusion, it is very much recommended that you've got to get specific on what you're trying to measure. You have to set those goals. Otherwise, that awareness won't be there and you'll keep doing the same. Not out of, explicit discrimination. It's out of just not being aware or not being intentional.
Sounds good. I'm going to rush us a little bit because I realize we have about 4 minutes left. So I'm listing kind of the 6 learnings here, and I'll just have you talk to more briefly, I guess, as we go.
We've talked a lot about iteration, right? It's
Mhm.
it's an iterative process. It's a journey. You have to keep adjusting. We conducted a training once, and this is a funny story because it was a little bit newer kind of training in the organization. We did a survey. How did you like the training? We looked at different demographic groups, and our older, more tenured folks said, "Wow, this was wonderful. It was great." Our millennials and Gen Z were like, "Really, this is it? So, this is all you have for us?" So again, we've got these multiple generations in the workplace, and you've got to focus on all those groups and kind of what's important to them, and also how do you utilize them to carry forward the conversation. And again, we used to talk about tough conversations or difficult conversations, but I really believe it's about curious conversations. The more you talk with each other and adopt an attitude of curiosity to understand each other, the more we find that we actually have more in common than we have differences. And
Yeah.
and I'll swear by that in my experiences. And again, finally, integrating this into everything you do. It's not a separate initiative in a separate department. It becomes part of your talent strategy, your acquisition retention strategy. It becomes part of your business strategy, your innovation strategy. So, your customer strategy. So that's really what we have learned helps to make this stick.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's really no silver bullet. It's a kind of a broader, iterative approach. It takes time. It's unique to your organization, but jump in with both feet and do something.
And I would say, yes, jump in, because if you wait, you just can't afford to do that. So
Right.
jump in and you'll find your way. You'll
Yeah,
find and
effort
your
counts.
employees will help you. Your employees
Yeah.
will help you.
Keep asking measure. So the measure piece, I'll talk briefly about. We've got a framework here. We've been measuring this for years now. And as we look at kind of how to understand and measure these topics, we look at these 4 constructs around, voice, belonging, growth, and then the organization commitment. I'm not going to spend too much time here other than there's some really cool ways you can analyze this and really understand how different populations feel about these topics. You can dive into your results pretty deeply. So we always encourage people to do an employee survey, ask questions about these topics, and look at your different populations, because you have some good data there to kind of start with and work with. We say your annual employee survey gives you some good direction, and then the real work happens within the initiatives and committees that you create.
And Charles, I'll mention we've done this, right? We've used the DecisionWise survey. We've carved out a diversity index from that based on your research. And we look at that information by different groups, and it's helped us in making, decisions around our strategy. It's really an important part. And then, checking in and we just did a pulse with some of our folks based on our engagement data.
Excellent. And as a bonus, kind of the bonus content for attending today are these discussion starter questions. So kind of a worksheet or a list of questions you can provide to leaders to talk about within their teams. And so we will be sending this out in an email to everyone that attends today, kind of the sheet to use. But Kristin, do you want to explain kind of how to use this?
I think this is a great starting point. Again, depending on your, maturity or readiness as an organization, where you are in your journey. But we have used this just within our own leadership team as a starting point. As we got more comfortable, you can start broadening that within the larger team and just putting a question out there and let's talk about it. Again, so much of this is about creating that awareness and having the conversation.
Perfect. Well, Kristin, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Our time is up. Anything else you'd like to add, Kristin, before we close?
I would just mention that, this again is something that we have to realize that at some point we have to step into the journey. We have to remember that giving each other experiences that connect us to each other is just as important as giving charitable donations. Changing our mindsets is just as important as changing our policies. And, we do have to take a stand with our different groups in our organizations. Our American Asian communities have suffered in more recent years. Our Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ allies. It's just as important as to speak with one voice in support of all groups as it is to stand with individual groups. So, again, I think that that's just an important part of who we have to be as businesses.
Excellent. Well, Kristin, thank you again very much. Again, if you have any questions, just email us at info@decisionwise.com, and look forward to our follow-up email with a link to this discussion starter question set. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day.